The rain hammered down in sheets over the winding mountain road. Serafina Shaw gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles bone-white, as the headlights of the SUV behind her flared in the rearview mirror. Too close, too fast, blinding. The impact came a split second later. A violent shove against her rear bumper that sent her sedan skidding toward the guardrail. Metal shrieked against metal. The guardrail buckled. Then the car was airborne, tumbling, the world outside the windshield spinning in a blur of rain and rock and darkness. Muddy water poured through the shattered window, filling her mouth with the taste of earth and blood. And the last thing she saw before everything went black was a silhouette standing at the edge of the road above. A phone screen glowing faintly, illuminating a face she knew all too well. Camilla Shaw. Her stepmother. When Serafina opened her eyes, the ceiling was leaking. She lay very still, staring at the yellow water stain spreading across the plaster, pulling her memories out of the mud one by one. The mountain road, the blinding lights, the shriek of the guardrail tearing through the car door. Her body felt like it had been disassembled and put back together by someone who had lost the instructions. 3 broken ribs. A fractured left arm. A gash running from her eyebrow to her cheekbone where the shattered glass had carved its signature into her face. She tried to move her fingers. The tips brushed against rough hospital cotton and the cold steel of an external fixation frame. Awake, are we? A round face leaned into view. A woman in her 50s, a floral blouse peeking out from beneath a white coat, holding a chipped enamel mug. Toughest luck I've ever seen. Car burned to a skeleton and you got thrown clear into a thicket of trees. Don't know which god was watching over you, but you'd better thank them. Serafina tried to speak. Her throat felt like it had been sandpapered. Don't rush. The woman dipped a cotton swab in water and pressed it to Serafina's lips. I'm Maggie Zhang, head nurse at Locust Grove Community Clinic. You came in with nothing. Police ran your information, came up blank. You remember your name. No identification. No records. Nothing. Conrad Shaw had been thorough. He had erased every trace of her existence. Her social security, her bank accounts, her phone number. A living person deleted from every system in the country. Good. That was exactly what she needed. Serafina Shaw. Her voice came out a dry rasp. 27. Nursing degree. Maggie blinked. Good, you remember. I'll have to let the police. Maggie. Serafina cut her off, her ruined voice scraping out each word with careful deliberation. Aside from my name and my degree, I don't remember anything. Nothing at all. Maggie turned back to look at her. Her gaze lingered on the bandages covering half of Serafina's face. There was sympathy there, but also the sharpness of a woman who had seen enough of life to recognize a strategic retreat when she saw one. She let out a long breath. Fine. Stay here. I'm short-handed anyway. Serafina stayed at Locust Grove for 4 months. The doctors had said 100 days to heal broken bones. She was on her feet in less than 120. The scab on her left cheek fell away, leaving a pale pink scar that traced a line from her brow to her cheekbone. She asked Maggie for a surgical mask and never took it off in front of anyone again except to eat and sleep. The clinic was tucked deep in the old district, at the end of an alley with a crooked locust tree out front, its sign yellowed by decades of cooking smoke. The patients were elderly neighbors and migrant workers renting rooms nearby, colds, fevers, blood pressure checks, the occasional child with a scraped knee. Maggie had 3 staff under her. Serafina was the quietest. She didn't talk. She didn't socialize. She didn't ask questions. Every morning at 6:30, she arrived to wipe down the examination tables, count the medication inventory, change 4 bags for the elderly patients. Her hands were steady. Her movements were fast. She could find a vein on the first stick every time. The most impossible thread-like vessels seemed to line up for her like routes drawn on a map. After 2 months of watching her, Maggie handed over all the wound care and basic nursing to her without a second thought. You trained somewhere big, Maggie said one day. That technique doesn't come from anywhere but an ICU rotation. 3 years minimum. Serafina didn't answer. She adjusted and 4 dripped to 40 drops per minute, her head bent, her hair pulled back in a low ponytail, the sleeves of her white uniform frayed at the edges. Above the mask, only her eyes were visible, slightly upturned at the corners, but the gaze was always lowered, like the surface of a frozen lake. No one at Locust Grove knew that the quiet nurse who cleaned bedpans and took blood pressure went home every night to a rented room with 3 monitors. One was linked to an encrypted satellite network, tracking the real-time stock price and R&D pipeline of Shaw Pharmaceuticals. One was connected to the Global Clinical Trials database. The last was her private server, storing the complete research data for 3 internationally patented targeted cancer therapies. The patent holder was listed as Vesper Lab, and Vesper Lab's sole chief scientist was Serafina Shaw herself. By day, she took blood pressure for elderly patients. By night, she directed research teams across 6 countries, pushing 3 targeted therapies through clinical trials. Among them, MS-07, a third-generation EGFR inhibitor, had already completed Phase 2 trials in the United States and the European Union. Its objective response rate crushed every competitor on the market, including the so-called flagship new drug that Shaw Pharmaceuticals was about to unveil. Every page of that flagship drug's data had been stolen from Serafina's research 3 years ago. Saturday morning, 7 o'clock. A free clinic tent went up outside Locust Grove. Serafina crouched on the ground, rolling blood pressure cuffs into storage boxes while Maggie counted out boxes of test strips and muttered about the heat. A white Porsche Cayenne pulled up at the mouth of the alley. The door opened and a pair of Jimmy Choo stilettos touched down on the pavement, followed by a pale pink Chanel dress. Victoria Shaw removed her sunglasses, frowning at the clinic's peeling sign like she was confirming she hadn't wandered into the wrong neighborhood by mistake. "This is the place," said Leo Lin, her assistant, holding a bag printed with the Shaw Pharmaceuticals logo. His face screwed up as if he'd stepped in something unpleasant. Deputy Chairwoman Shaw said this free clinic is a district partnership project. Every clinic gets promotional materials and sample packs. This one's tiny, but it's on the list. Victoria took the bag with 2 fingers, holding it away from her body like it was contaminated, and walked over to the tent. She glanced down at the woman crouched on the ground organizing supplies, a pair of calm eyes above a blue surgical mask, hands still moving. "You." Victoria's voice carried the natural arrogance of someone who had never been told no. "Put these brochures on the table. Hand one to every person who comes for a checkup. And this box of samples, Shaw Pharmaceuticals joint care supplements. Display them next to your clinic's medications. If anyone comes for medicine, recommend these first." Serafina looked up at her. For half a second, those eyes overlapped with a pair Victoria remembered. But she dismissed it instantly. That person was dead. The car had burned to a shell 3 years ago. This woman was wearing a washed-out nurse's uniform, a cheap mask, her hair tied back carelessly, radiating the beaten-down compliance of someone life had worn smooth. That other woman had been proud as a blade. She would never have bent. "Are you deaf?" Victoria dropped the bag at Serafina's feet. "Move faster. The officials will be here for inspection soon." Serafina stood. She picked up the bag and set it aside. "Community-free clinics have regulations," she said, her voice level. "Promoting any kind of medication is prohibited." Victoria blinked. She tilted her head to read the ID badge pinned to Serafina's chest. Nurse Serafina Shaw. Her pupils contracted sharply. The same name? There were plenty of people in the world with the same name. And besides, that person would never be caught dead in a place like this. Regulations. Victoria let out a short laugh. From her handbag, she pulled out a red letterhead document and waved it in front of Serafina's face. "This is a strategic partnership agreement between the District Health Bureau and Shaw Pharmaceuticals. Your tiny little clinic answers to the Health Bureau, doesn't it? You're an orderly. Know how to take blood pressure. Then stick to taking blood pressure. Leave the rest to the people who matter." She bit down hard on the word orderly. Maggie came bustling out of the clinic, saw the confrontation, and immediately stepped in. "Miss Shaw, so sorry about this. Serafina's new, doesn't know the ropes yet. We'll hand out the brochures, of course we will." She elbowed Serafina in the side. Serafina lowered her head and went back to organizing the blood pressure monitors. Her fingers paused on the valve for half a beat, the knuckles whitening, then relaxed. Victoria gave a satisfied hum and turned to go. A black Audi A6 pulled up at the mouth of the alley. A Chinese medical association. 他跌在挡风玻璃上. The door opened and an elderly man stepped out, white hair, a dark gray Zhongshan suit, a red velvet certificate folder in his hand. Victoria froze. Albert Zhou, president of the Chinese Medical Association, a titan of clinical medicine whose name carried weight in every research hospital in the country. What was someone of his stature doing in an alley that didn't even show up on GPS? Her smile snapped back into place as she rushed forward. President Zhou. What an honor. I'm Victoria Shaw from Shaw Pharmaceuticals. I attended your lecture at the annual forum last year. Zhou nodded at her, his gaze already drifting past her shoulder toward the free clinic tent. His eyes lit up. He strode forward, practically breaking into a jog, and stopped in front of the tent. Professor Shaw. Zhou held out the certificate folder with both hands, his voice booming loud enough for the entire alley to hear. That paper you anonymously submitted to the Chinese Journal of Clinical Oncology last month. Third-generation EGFR inhibitor resistance mechanisms and combination therapy strategies. All 9 members of the review committee voted it best paper of the year. I've come personally to deliver your specially appointed expert certificate. Please, no more refusals this time. The entire alley went silent for 3 full seconds. The box of test strips slipped from Maggie's hands and scattered across the ground. Victoria's smile froze on her face like a cracked mask. Leo's sun umbrella tilted, the sun beating down directly on Victoria's meticulously styled curls, but she didn't even notice. The elderly residents waiting in line pulled out their phones and started recording. Serafina rose to her feet. She peeled off her gloves and accepted the certificate with both hands. The gesture was neither humble nor arrogant. Above the mask, her eyes curved slightly, the closest thing to a smile. President Zhou is too kind. That paper was only a preliminary summary. It hardly deserves best paper of the year. Nonsense. It absolutely does. Zhou burst out laughing, clapping her on the shoulder. Having Professor Shaw willing to come back to the academic world is a gift to the entire field. Victoria's pupils were vibrating. She stared at the hands that had accepted the certificate, long, steady fingers, a faint scar across the knuckle of the ring finger. She knew how that scar had gotten there. A shattered petri dish years ago during a cell culture experiment. She had watched those hands operate flow cytometers, analyze chromatography readouts, type out line after line of genetic sequencing data late into the night. It couldn't be. It was impossible. That person's car had flipped off a mountain road. Every trace of her identity had been wiped clean. She could not be standing here, outside a clinic that didn't even have air conditioning, being addressed as Professor Shaw by the president of the Chinese Medical Association. Serafina pulled her gloves back on and sat down at the examination table. She picked up the blood pressure cuff and said to the elderly man at the front of the line, "Please have a seat, sir. Roll up your sleeve and relax your arm." Albert Zhou dragged over a plastic stool and sat down beside her, already talking about inviting her to be the keynote speaker at the next academic conference. Serafina took the old man's blood pressure while calmly discussing the latest clinical data on EGFR-targeted therapies with Zhou, the technical terms rolling off her tongue as casually as if she were discussing the price of vegetables. Victoria felt a cold dread seeping up from her bones. Leo leaned in. "Miss Shaw, probably just the same name, right? That other Serafina Shaw died 3 years ago." "Shut up." Victoria's voice came out between clenched teeth. She turned and walked toward the Kian, her heels clicking a frantic rhythm against the pavement. The moment the car door closed, she dialed her mother. "Mom, I saw someone at the free clinic today. Her name is Serafina Shaw. And she looks like..." 3 seconds of silence on the other end. Then Camilla Shaw's voice came through, cold as a railroad track in winter. "Don't panic. Tell me everything. From the beginning." The white Porsche pulled away from the alley. Serafina lowered her stethoscope and watched the car disappear into the shade of the trees. Her fingers gave the rubber bulb of the blood pressure cuff a gentle squeeze. Beneath the mask, the corner of her mouth curved upward, almost imperceptibly. The fish were starting to bite. Maggie had been holding it in for as long as she could. She sidled over. "Serafina, tell me the truth. Who are you?" Serafina wrapped the blood pressure cuff and handed it to her. "Maggie, I'm the nurse at your clinic. Monthly salary $3,005. Meals included, housing not included." Maggie opened her mouth, closed it, bent down to pick up her scattered test strips and sighed. Fine. Don't tell me. But watching that Porsche lady's face turn green, that was worth every second. A black Mercedes S-Class was parked across the street, at the curb. In the driver's seat sat a man in his early 30s, his brow bone high, his eyes sharp as a scalpel. He was scrolling through photos on his phone, the moment Alberto had presented the certificate to the masked nurse. Director Liu. The assistant in the passenger seat turned around. There are irregularities in the approval application materials for Shaw Pharmaceuticals' new drug, Regenza. The bureau wants you to lead the verification team. Lucien Liu locked his phone screen and pulled his gaze back from the locust tree and the free clinic tent beneath it. Find out everything about that nurse, the one who just received the certificate. Someone who can make Alberto personally deliver a specially appointed expert certificate is not just a community nurse. He paused. As for Shaw Pharmaceuticals, don't rush. Let them hold their launch event. Let them make all their claims. It's far more effective to tear the lies apart once they're all laid out on the table. The Mercedes pulled away. In the rearview mirror, Lucien caught one last glimpse of the figure sitting at the examination table. White uniform, blue mask, lowered eyes. He pressed the accelerator and merged into the flow of the city. The afternoon at Locust Grove was quiet. Maggie dozed in the duty room, the electric fan oscillating back and forth, ruffling the shift schedule tacked to the wall. Serafina sat in the pharmacy, updating the medication inventory on the computer, her fingers moving at an unhurried pace. A week had passed since the global live-stream event at the Shaw Pharmaceuticals launch. Their stock had hit the limit down the next morning and stayed there for 3 consecutive trading days, evaporating nearly $4 billion in market value. The National Medical Products Administration had formed a special investigation team. The Center for Drug Evaluation had suspended Regenza's market application review. The Securities Regulatory Commission had issued a formal demand for Shaw Pharmaceuticals to explain the authenticity of their data. Camilla had held an emergency press conference, tearfully denouncing malicious attacks by competitors, but the flood of public opinion had already broken the dam. Serafina herself had not made a single public appearance since that day. Every media outlet that contacted Vesper Lab received the same standard response. Dr. Shaw is currently in seclusion, focused on new drug research. She is not accepting interviews. But the protagonist of this story was, at this moment, sitting in the pharmacy of a community clinic, making notes on a medication inventory with a ballpoint pen. Outside, cicadas droned. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Her phone vibrated. A message from Jasper Run, her second-in-command at Nebula Capital. Shaw Pharmaceuticals sent someone to negotiate. They're offering $1 billion to drop the lawsuit. How do we respond? She typed back 2 words. Double it. Another buzz. Got it. She flipped the phone face down on the desk. Footsteps pounded up the hallway, and Nurse Xiaozhou burst in breathless. Maggie, Shaoli has a fever. We don't have enough people to deliver materials for the summit. Maggie came out of the duty room rubbing her eyes. What summit? The East China Pharmaceutical Innovation Summit at the Convention Center. Several city officials are going to be there. Our clinic was tapped to send 2 people for logistics support, but Xiaoli's temperature is 39 and she can't go. Xiaozhou was practically jumping up and down with anxiety. Maggie glanced in Serafina's direction. Serafina, I'll cover your afternoon shift. You go with Xiaozhou to the convention center. They'll feed you dinner. Better than the cafeteria. Serafina's fingers paused on the keyboard. The East China Pharmaceutical Innovation Summit. Shaw Pharmaceuticals was this year's title sponsor. Camilla and Victoria would both be in attendance. She hadn't planned on showing her face, but now that Maggie had spoken, refusing would only draw more attention. She saved the inventory file, stood up, and removed her sleeve protectors. Fine. Let me change. The convention center was the size of 3 football fields. Crystal chandeliers cascading golden light from the vaulted ceiling. Volunteers in dark blue vests moved through the halls with practiced efficiency. Serafina walked in through a side entrance, a stack of document packets in her arms, her hair tucked under a cap, the surgical mask covering half her face. Xiaozhou trailed beside her, mouth hanging open at the opulence. Place the packets in seat order, left to right, 1 per seat, Serafina instructed. After that, go help at the registration desk. Don't wander. Xiao Zhou stuck out her tongue and sprinted off. Serafina moved down the VIP aisle, each document packet placed at precisely the same distance from the edge of the table. She had just reached the third row when a hand darted out and snatched the packet from her grip. Even handing out documents takes forever these days. How do they train you volunteers? Victoria Shaw stood there in a black suit dress, red-soled heels, not bothering to glance at the person she had just grabbed from. She turned to the staff behind her. The VIP section packets need the Shaw Regenza brochure on top of everything else. Understood. The staff member nodded frantically. Victoria swept a dismissive glance over the blue-vested volunteer and waved her hand. Well? Go get the bottled water from the back and put one on every seat. Move. Serafina looked at her for a moment, said nothing, and turned toward the backstage area. Victoria was already checking her reflection in her phone, muttering about the declining quality of volunteers these days. She was about to put the phone away when a man in his 50s emerged from the VIP corridor, thinning hair, gold-rimmed glasses, scanning the room as if searching for someone. Professor Zhao. Victoria's smile snapped back into place. You're here. The panel's been waiting for you. Marcus Zhao was one of the leading authorities in clinical pharmacology and the head of the summit's expert review panel. His opinion on Regenza would be critical to its approval. Camilla had spent the past month laying the groundwork, at least 5 dinners, countless gifts. But Zhao merely shook her hand, his eyes still searching the room. Suddenly, his face lit up, and he strode toward the side aisle of the hall. Professor Shaw. It really is you. He practically jogged over, his voice loud enough to turn heads throughout the hall. Victoria's smile froze for the second time that month. She turned, her neck stiff with dread, and watched as Marcus Zhao grasped the hands of a volunteer in a blue vest. Her cap pulled low, a few strands of hair escaping at the temples. The volunteer removed the cap, revealing her full face. Victoria felt her stomach seize. It was her. Again. At the free clinic had been one coincidence. But here among the volunteers, this woman had just been addressed as Professor Shaw by one of the most respected pharmacologists in the country, not with politeness but with genuine bone-deep respect. Serafina exchanged a few pleasantries with Zhao. Then, as if remembering something, she said, Professor Zhao, have you had a chance to read the paper Shaw Pharmaceuticals published in the summit proceedings? The one on Regenza. Zhao blinked. Not in detail yet. Why? I suggest you read it now. Serafina pulled a Shaw Pharmaceuticals brochure from a document packet and flipped to the clinical data graphs. The sample size calculation uses a formula from outdated guidelines, 20 years out of date. The interim analysis boundaries were set using a fixed boundary method, but the sample size formula uses spinning function parameters. The two methods don't match. The calculated results are off by at least 15%. She turned to another page and tapped a forest plot. And here, the interaction test for the subgroup analysis. The p-value is listed as 0.23. I ran the same data. The actual p-value should be 0.47. Marcus Zhao's face changed. He snatched the brochure, pulled out his reading glasses, and his expression grew grimmer by the second. Finally, he slapped the brochure down on the table. Statistical flaws. 3 of them. Basic sample size estimation, and Shaw Pharmaceuticals can't even get that right. And they have the audacity to come present at a summit. A crowd had gathered. Experts were pulling out their own brochures, checking the numbers. The murmur grew louder. She's right. The formula is cited wrong. Methods and parameters don't match. That's basic statistics. 3 hard flaws. This would get rejected by the NMPA on first review. Victoria stood at the edge of the crowd, her makeup flawless, her smile twitching uncontrollably. She couldn't follow the statistical arguments, but she could read Marcus Zhao's face. The face of a man publicly humiliated by being shown a glaring elementary error. And that expression was spreading to everyone around him. She wanted to lunge forward, to scream that this woman was lying, to throw the troublemaking volunteer out of the venue. But her feet were nailed to the floor. Serafina set the brochure back on the table. She picked up her cap and the remaining document packets and turned toward the backstage exit. The blue volunteer vest looked on her like a lab coat. Xiao Zhou came running over from registration. Serafina. I didn't understand a single word you said, but that woman in the suit, her face went green again. Are the documents all handed out? 2 rows left. Then keep handing them out. As she walked, Serafina pulled out her phone. 3 unread messages. The first was from Jasper. Shaw Pharmaceuticals stock dropped another 6% today. We finished building our position. Average cost 3.2. The second was from Franklin by. I found the original files on Camilla's academic misconduct from years ago, along with your mother's original lab notebooks. When can we meet? The third was from an unknown number. Dr. Shaw, this is Lucian Liu, specially appointed pharmaceutical compliance expert at the NMPA. The Regenza verification is about to begin. I was hoping to consult you on several technical matters. Please reply if convenient. Serafina stood in the corridor, the motion sensor light overhead clicking off and plunging her into shadow. She replied to Franklin first. Tomorrow afternoon. Vesper Lab, Conference Room 3. Then she opened the unknown number's message and typed a single word. When? The light clicked back on, illuminating her face. Above the mask, her eyes were calm and sharp. In those eyes was calculation, strategy, and a blade that had been pressed down for 3 years and was still razor keen. The next afternoon, Vesper Lab headquarters. The building was hidden behind a grove of ginkgo trees. A white geometric structure, 6 stories, looking more like an understated art museum than a research facility. No logo. No grand entrance. Just a discreet address number and a card access gate. Yet this unremarkable building had, in the past 3 years, filed 11 international patents and was simultaneously running 3 new drugs through clinical trials in the United States and the European Union. Everyone in the biopharmaceutical world was trying to figure out who stood behind Vesper. Serafina stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of Conference Room 3, holding a cup of black Americano, no sugar. White silk blouse, sleeves rolled to the elbows. Black trousers sharply tailored. Her hair hung loose, and in the natural light, the scar on her left cheek was barely visible. The door opened and Jasper Wren walked in, arms full of folders. Black shirt under a gray vest, tie loose around his neck. He looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days, but his eyes were bright, hound bright, the eyes of a predator who had caught the scent. Shaw Pharmaceuticals dropped another 4 points today. Cumulative decline since the launch event is over 35%. Their biggest institutional investor has started quietly offloading, and we've absorbed more than half of what they've dumped, routed through 3 different shell companies. Nebula Capital now holds close to 8% of Shaw Pharmaceuticals. Serafina took a sip of coffee and gestured for him to continue. Camilla's been scrambling for cash. She's approached over 20 firms. Not one is willing to touch it. The banks are pulling back too. The one that was going to do the equity pledge saw the launch event and changed their minds overnight. Shaw's cash flow has at most 2 months left. If Regenza doesn't get market approval by then, their capital chain snaps. No one can save them. 2 months is too long. Serafina set down her coffee. Have the Securities Regulatory Commission release this quarter's short-selling report ahead of schedule. Focus on Shaw's accounts payable turnover. What banks fear most isn't losses. It's liquidity risk. One bank calls in its loans, the rest will follow. Jasper's eyes gleamed. You're driving them off a cliff. I'm just helping them walk a little faster. They owe too many debts. Regenza alone isn't enough. Her tone was as flat as if she were commenting on the weather. I want Camilla to understand that everything she took from me will become a nail driven into her flesh. Jasper looked at her profile. He had known her for 3 years. The first time he saw her, she was lying in a hospital bed. Steel pins holding her together, her face wrapped in gauze, thin as a bone that might snap at any moment. But her eyes had been lucid, sharp, carrying the ferocity of someone who had crawled back from the edge of death. One more thing. Leo Lin has been making moves. Serafina's gaze sharpened. He went to a bathhouse on the east side 2 nights ago. Met with a man named Ma San for over 3 hours. Ma San runs a construction company on paper, but his real business is debt collection and disposing of stolen goods. He's got a crew of 12 thugs with criminal records. Jasper's expression was serious. Camilla isn't going to just sit there and take it. Be careful. Serafina was quiet for a moment. Then the corner of her mouth curved upward. so faint it was barely there. Camilla has finally figured it out. She realizes every legitimate channel is blocked, the NMPA investigation, the Capitol siege, the public opinion pressure. All three fronts are collapsing. When a cornered person sees only one door left, they will open it, even if there's an abyss on the other side. You think she'll make a move against you directly? Jasper's brow furrowed. Should I arrange protection? Not yet. She won't act now, too many eyes, broad daylight. She'll wait for an opportunity to make me disappear quietly, just like 3 years ago. Serafina paused, and her voice was as calm as if she were reciting a chemical equation. And I will help her create that opportunity. The conference room door opened. The receptionist leaned in. Professor Shaw, your guests have arrived. One is a Mr. Bai, who says he's your uncle. The other is a Mr. Liu, who says he has an appointment. Serafina stood and adjusted her cuffs. Show them in. Franklin Bai entered first. At 70, his back was still straight as a pine, his white hair neatly combed, an old leather briefcase in his hand. The moment he saw Serafina, his eyes reddened. You look just like her. Just like your mother. Especially the way you stand. She used to stand in the lab exactly like that. Coffee in her left hand, right hand in the pocket of her lab coat. Serafina stepped forward quickly to take his arm. Uncle Franklin, please sit. He held onto her hand, unwilling to let go, studying her face. His gaze stopped on the scar on her left cheek, and the corner of his mouth twitched. When I got the news that you'd been in an accident, I couldn't believe it. Your mother's lab notebooks. She asked me to keep them for you. She said when you were older, she would give them to you herself. And then what I got instead was the news that you'd been thrown out of the Shaw family, that your car had gone off a mountain road. 3 years. I thought I would go to my grave waiting for you. You kept them safe all this time. Your mother entrusted them to me before she died. I would never let them go. Franklin opened his briefcase and carefully withdrew an acid-free paper-wrapped folder. The cover was yellowed, the edges worn, but it had been preserved with extraordinary care. A white label on the front bore a line of elegant handwriting. Vivian Shaw Laboratory Notebooks and Supplementary Materials. Serafina reached out. Her fingertips paused for just a moment when they touched the cover. She opened the first page and her mother's handwriting flooded her vision, dense experimental records, hand-drawn molecular structure sketches, impromptu notes scribbled in the margins. At the back of the folder, tucked into a pocket, was a folded letter. She unfolded it. Her mother's handwriting was forceful, the pen nearly tearing through the paper in places. Serafina, if you are reading these notebooks, it means I am no longer here. Shaw Pharmaceuticals was your grandfather's life's work, and it was all of my youth. But the most important thing I am leaving you is not the company. It is the knowledge in these pages. Knowledge will never betray you. When you have nothing else, it will be your strongest weapon. Remember, making medicine is like being a person. You can be without money. You cannot be without principles. Serafina folded the letter, tucked it back into the folder, and drew a deep breath. When she looked up, Franklin saw something in her eyes, not tears, but the cold gleam of light off a blade. Uncle Franklin, you said you had evidence of Camilla's academic misconduct? Franklin's expression hardened. From the inner pocket of his briefcase, he withdrew a manila envelope and spread several yellowed photocopies across the table. Camilla published a paper during graduate school. Someone reported her for lifting the core experimental data wholesale from another researcher's published work, down to the numbers after the decimal point. The university formed an investigation committee. Before the findings came out, Camilla dropped out and married your father. The case was buried. I kept the investigation materials all these years. The person who reported her was one of my graduate students. He saw Camilla in the lab, photographing someone else's original data notebooks. Serafina read through every page of the photocopies. Then she set them aside. Uncle Franklin, this is significant. But academic misconduct alone is a matter of ethics in the public eye, not a criminal charge. What I need is the evidence that will put Camilla in prison, the murder of my mother, the attempted murder of me, the clinical trial data falsification that endangered patient safety. Murder. Franklin's pupils contracted violently. You're saying Vivian's death was not an accident? 3 months before my mother died, Camilla was already a regular presence in the Shaw household, acting as Conrad Shaw's personal assistant. Less than 2 months after my mother's death, Camilla moved in. The timeline is very convenient. Last week, I obtained a copy of my mother's medical records. The cause of death is listed as acute pancreatitis with multiple organ failure, but her blood amylase and lipase levels were only mildly elevated, nowhere near the diagnostic threshold for severe pancreatitis. What actually caused her organ failure was a drug that, when overdosed, induces multi-organ collapse. But there is no prescription record for that drug in my mother's file. Franklin's hands were shaking. He slammed a palm on the conference table, sending ripples across the surface of a water glass. I knew it. I knew Vivian's death was suspicious. She had been running Shaw Pharmaceuticals brilliantly. There was no reason for her to suddenly fall ill like that. That woman. That's why I'm not just trying to destroy her reputation. Serafina's voice was calm, but it was the calm of something frozen solid. I'm going to make her pay back every life she took, every debt she owes. Down to the last cent. The room was silent for a moment. Then a clear male voice came from the doorway. Well said. All three turned. Lucien Liu stood at the threshold. Dark gray suit, tie perfectly knotted, a black briefcase in his left hand. Early 30s. Strong facial structure, high brow bone, eyes that were deep-set and restrained. He looked like a freshly honed scalpel, sharp, clean, carrying nothing extraneous. Forgive me. The door was open. I overheard part of that. He walked in, his gaze resting on Serafina for a moment. Dr. Shaw. I'm Lucien Liu. I was the one who sent you that message at the convention center. Serafina stood and shook his hand. When their hands met, Lucien felt something unexpected. Not softness, not nervousness, but a steady, dry, almost provocative calm. Director Liu. Perfect timing. Which direction is the NMPA planning to take for the Regenza verification? Lucien sat, his briefcase on his knee, his gaze direct. Starting with clinical trial data traceability. Our team has already pulled the original medical records and lab reports from all Regenza clinical trial sites. We'll be checking inclusion and exclusion criteria, randomization procedures, blinding maintenance, efficacy evaluation, and adverse event reporting, item by item. Estimated timeline, 4 to 6 weeks. Too slow. Serafina's response was immediate. The trial sites Camilla bribed aren't going to sit around waiting for you. They'll have plenty of time to destroy original records and coordinate their stories. In 4 to 6 weeks, at least half the evidence you could have found will be gone. Lucien's eyebrows lifted slightly. In the entire drug regulatory system, no one outside the investigation team had ever dared to tell him, to his face, that he was too slow. But the woman in front of him said it without arrogance, without accusation, just the objective judgment of someone who knew the process inside out. What do you suggest? A double-blind verification approach. Serafina picked up a whiteboard marker and drew a concise flowchart. Traditional verification follows the data path from the trial sites upward. Forward traceability. Data fabricators will always leave traces on this chain. The same blood panel appearing at different time points. Abnormal gaps between the creation timestamps of original imaging files and their upload timestamps. Deleted records hidden in the electronic medical record modification logs. In a forward verification, these traces are easy to miss. But if you reverse match from the NMPA's terminal database, flagging every data node that fails logical consistency, then target those nodes for focused verification, your efficiency increases by at least a factor of 3. She set down the marker and turned to face him. I've already run every publicly available Regenza clinical data point. I found 17 nodes with logical inconsistencies. You can start with those. Lucien was silent for 3 seconds. He stared at the flowchart on the whiteboard, his gaze moving across every arrow and annotation, before settling on Serafina's face. 17 nodes. You did this alone. I wrote an automated comparison program. Not worth mentioning. She walked back to the table and sat. Director Liu, I can give you the detailed analysis report on all 17 nodes, original data sources, comparison logic. But I have one condition. Everything the investigation uncovers must be made public. This cannot become another case of internal resolution between the regulator and the company. Lucien looked into her eyes for a long time. Those eyes were as still as a lake in deep winter, but there were blades beneath the surface. "Done," he said. Then unexpectedly he smiled. It was a faint smile, there and gone, like the flash of an operating light off a scalpel. "Dr. Shaw, you could be chief scientific officer at any top pharmaceutical company in the world. 7-figure salary. Universal respect. Why choose to work as a nurse in a community clinic?" Serafina picked up her now cold coffee and took a sip. Her voice was as flat as if she were telling someone else's story. "Because at the clinic, every day I see what happens when patients can't afford their medications. People skip hypertension treatment because blood pressure pills cost $200 a month. People diagnosed with tumors don't get genetic testing because a single test costs thousands, and even if they get tested, they can't afford the targeted therapy, so they just go home to die." She set the cup down. The sound of ceramic meeting wood was crisp and final. When drug developers forget about patients, it's worse than not developing drugs at all. Shaw Pharmaceuticals forgot. Camilla forgot. Conrad forgot. "I can't." Lucien said nothing more. From his briefcase, he withdrew a document, signed his name on the last page, and pushed it across the table toward her. "An appointment letter for an external expert to the verification team. You are hereby engaged as technical advisor for the Shaw Pharmaceuticals Regenza Special Verification. Term 3 months. Compensation per standard special expert rates. Before I signed it, I was prepared for you to refuse. Now I don't think you will." Serafina glanced at it, picked up a pen and signed. "I won't refuse. But I don't need compensation. If the verification confirms that Regenza's data was falsified, I will push Nebula Capital to join with minority shareholders in filing a class action lawsuit against Shaw Pharmaceuticals. When that happens, Director Liu, all I'll need from you is your testimony in court." Lucien tucked the signed appointment letter into his briefcase and rose. "Agreed. But one thing you should know. Shaw Pharmaceuticals filed an administrative review request with the NMPA this morning. They're seeking to have the external expert list for the verification team rejected. Their argument is that you were once a Shaw Pharmaceuticals employee and therefore have a conflict of interest." Serafina smiled. The mask was off now, and the smile reached her eyes, a smile tinged with contempt and something almost playful. "Administrative review? Camilla's still using the same playbook. Let her. I've got 3 months. That's plenty of time for her to go through multiple rounds of review." Lucien walked to the door, then turned back. The woman at the conference table was leafing through her mother's notebooks, her white silk blouse catching the afternoon light, her fingers turning the pages with unhurried care. A strange thought struck him. This woman didn't need anyone's help. She was an army unto herself. "Dr. Shaw. Next week, the verification team makes its first on-site visit to Shaw Pharmaceuticals R&D Center. 9 in the morning. I'll meet you at the entrance." The door closed. Serafina was alone. Her mother's notebooks lay open before her. On her right, the evidence of Camilla's academic fraud. On her left, the appointment letter signed by Lucien Liu. Outside the window, ginkgo shadows fell across the whiteboard, landing exactly on the final arrow of the verification flowchart. She picked up her phone and opened her encrypted messaging app. She found the contact labeled CDC Director and typed, "Director Chan, I'll participate in next month's emergency response drill. Also, I need you to pull a death record from 12 years ago. Vivian Shaw. Date of death, March 17th. Admitting hospital. First People's Hospital. Sent." She locked the screen, closed her eyes, and let her fingers rest lightly on the cover of her mother's notebook. 3 years. She had waited 3 years for this moment, to step out of the darkness and into the light, to make every person who owed her look her in the face, and then to collect. One by one. She opened her eyes. The lake beneath was frozen solid. At 8:30 the next morning, the Shaw Pharmaceuticals headquarters gleamed in the sunlight. A 32-story glass tower with an $8 million crystal chandelier in the lobby. But the atmosphere was a wire pulled to its breaking point. The NMPA verification team was en route. Word had spread through the company yesterday afternoon. Legal had pulled an all-nighter preparing documents. R&D had scrambled to double-check every lab notebook. Administration had scrubbed every corner spotless. Camilla had slept less than 3 hours since the previous afternoon, but there was no trace of fatigue on her face. Her makeup was flawless. Her hair was immaculate. She stood in the lobby, awaiting the team, her posture polite and guarded. Victoria stood beside her, pale dark circles beneath her eyes that even concealer couldn't hide. Ever since the summit, when Serafina had publicly exposed the statistical flaws in Regenza, Victoria had been having nightmares in which Serafina removed her mask to reveal that scarred face. At 8:50, 4 black government vehicles pulled up at the entrance. A dozen staff in dark blue uniforms emerged, each carrying a briefcase or portable testing equipment. The man in the lead was in his mid-40s, a work badge hanging from his chest. Director Wang, Verification Division. Camilla stepped forward, all smiles, hand extended. Director Wang, welcome. The conference room is prepared. All materials have been organized per your requirements. Wang shook her hand without warmth. Let's follow procedure. We'll start at the R&D center at the source, the Clinical Trial Data Archive. The group moved toward the elevators. Then another black Mercedes S-Class pulled up at the entrance. Director Wang stopped. Camilla's smile froze. Lucien Liu stepped out of the driver's seat and walked around to open the rear passenger door. What made every pupil in that lobby contract was not Lucien Liu, but the second person who emerged from the back seat. Serafina Shaw wore a white standing collar coat, her hair pulled back in a sharp low ponytail. The scar on her left cheek was uncovered, no attempt to hide it. It was there, visible to every eye, as she stepped into the light. On her chest hung a blue work badge, National Medical Products Administration, specially appointed pharmaceutical compliance expert, Serafina Shaw. The air in the lobby froze for 5 full seconds. Shaw Pharmaceuticals employees stood paralyzed. The receptionist's hand flew to her mouth. Legal department staff exchanged looks of disbelief. Every set of eyes held the same 3 words. She is back. Victoria's face went white as paper. She grabbed her mother's arm, her nails digging into the fabric. Mom, how is she? Camilla shook off her daughter's hand. The smile had vanished. She stared at the badge on Serafina's chest for 3 seconds, then turned to Director Wang. Director Wang, this person is a former Shaw Pharmaceuticals employee with a significant conflict of interest. Her participation as a verification expert violates basic principles of administrative procedure. We filed a formal request for her recusal yesterday. Ms. Shaw. Lucien Liu stepped to the front of the group. From his briefcase, he withdrew a document. This is the Bureau's expedited written response to your recusal request. After review, Shaw Pharmaceuticals' application to exclude expert Serafina Shaw is denied. As the rightful owner of Regenza's original R&D data, Dr. Shaw is the most critical knowledgeable party for this verification. The Bureau finds that her participation does not constitute a conflict of interest. On the contrary, it is a necessary condition for ensuring the verification's thoroughness and accuracy. He placed the document in Camilla's hands, his tone flat but carrying unquestionable authority. If Ms. Shaw has objections, you may file an administrative lawsuit. However, until a court issues an effective judgment, expert Serafina Shaw's verification authority remains unaffected. Article 45 and Article 56 of the Administrative Procedure Law. Shall I recite them for you? Camilla took the document. Her fingers trembled almost imperceptibly. She had spent half a lifetime as a powerful woman, and no one had ever spoken to her like this in public. But every word Lucien Liu had said was anchored in legal code. There was no gap for her to squeeze through. She folded the document, tucked it into her bag, and took a breath. The smile returned, stretched tight. Since the Bureau has made its decision, we will of course cooperate. Expert Shaw, this way please. Serafina had not looked at Camilla once. She followed Director Wang and Lucien Liu into the elevator. Only at the last moment, as the doors were closing, did she tilt her head slightly and glance through the narrowing gap at Victoria. That glance was calm. No hatred. No mockery. Not even any particular emotion. But the instant Victoria caught it, a cold dread shot from the soles of her feet to the crown of her head. The elevator doors closed. Camilla turned, her smile gone. She leaned toward her secretary. Call Ma-san. Tell him to move the timeline up. The secretary hurried toward the fire stairs. The verification team split into 3 groups, one to examine the electronic data management system, one to pull physical original records, one to interview clinical trial personnel. Lucian and Serafina took the core assignment, the logical integrity verification of the clinical trial data. Serafina sat at a terminal connected to Shaw Pharmaceuticals' R&D database, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Lines of code and database queries scrolled down the screen. Every time she hit enter, a new set of comparison results appeared. Here, she pointed at a data record highlighted in red. Subject P087. Week 8 CT imaging assessment shows target lesion shrinkage of 32%. But at the same time point, the tumor marker CEA level is 45% higher than baseline. In EGFR-targeted therapy, these 2 indicators are strongly positively correlated. The probability of this kind of inverse divergence is less than 0.3%. Lucian leaned in. His frown deepened. And this isn't the only one? I'm at 6 so far. She switched to a statistical summary page. Regenza's Phase 3 trial enrolled 360 subjects total. According to their published data, the consistency coefficient between the primary and secondary efficacy endpoints should be above 0.8. But when you run the actual numbers from the raw data, the real consistency coefficient is 0.46. Lucian knew exactly what that number meant. A consistency coefficient of 0.46 in clinical trial data quality assessment fell squarely in the highly suspect category. It meant the data contained extensive traces of human intervention or fabrication. If that number appeared in the verification report, Regenza wouldn't just be denied market approval. Its existing clinical trial permit could be revoked. Export all the raw data for these flagged points. Seal them as evidence. Pull the complete modification logs from the electronic medical record system. The staff moved to comply. Serafina was already typing the next set of queries, her profile sharp in the blue glow of the screen. The scar on her left cheek flickered in and out of visibility. Lucian watched her. You knew this day would come. Her fingers didn't stop. I've been preparing for it since the moment my car went over that guardrail 3 years ago. Every dataset was backed up. Every lab record was time-stamped and encrypted. Every email chain is stored on offshore servers. Camilla thought burning the paper records and formatting the hard drives would solve everything. She doesn't realize that the real evidence was never on Shaw Pharmaceuticals servers. It's in my hands. She hit the final enter key. A full page of red flag data anomalies appeared. She turned her head and looked across the lab benches toward Camilla, who stood at the R&D center in trance, phone pressed to her ear. Miss Shaw, would you come take a look at this? Camilla hung up and walked over, her heels clicking a measured rhythm against the epoxy floor. She glanced at the flagged data. Her expression didn't flicker. Expert Shaw has been very thorough. Our R&D team will conduct its own review of these data points. If there are entry errors, we will report them truthfully to the verification team and follow the correction procedures. Entry errors? Serafina leaned back in her chair, hands folded on her knee, looking up at her. Out of 360 subjects, at least 50 have data anomalies of the same type and pattern. What kind of entry error, Ms. Shaw? Manages to precisely target every data point at the primary efficacy evaluation time points while perfectly avoiding every irrelevant baseline data point. Camilla's pupils contracted slightly, but her composure was immaculate. She smiled. It's not surprising that Expert Shaw is so familiar with our R&D data. After all, this is the mess you left behind. We spent 3 years barely managing to clean it up. If the verification team insists on Toijo the source of these data issues, perhaps the investigation should start with the original principal investigator, you. Lucian opened his mouth, but Serafina raised a hand to stop him. Miss Shaw is right. The Regenza clinical trial should indeed start with the principal investigator. That's why, before I came, I pulled the complete original trial protocol, ethics approval documents, investigator's brochure, and informed consent templates from the Phase 3 trial. From her briefcase, she withdrew a thick stack of documents and spread them across the lab bench. This is the clinical trial application I submitted as principal investigator in March 2019. It bears my signature and the Shaw Pharmaceuticals Company seal at that time. This is the Ethics Committee approval from June 2019. This is the trial progress report from January 2020, when I left Shaw Pharmaceuticals. At that point, Phase 2 had just completed enrollment. Phase 3 had not yet begun. She pushed the final document toward Camilla. And yet Regens's published Phase 3 clinical data shows subject enrollment beginning in November 2019, 3 full months before the actual timeline. Ms. Shaw, how did a trial phase that hadn't even started before I left manage to begin enrolling subjects before I left? The lab was so quiet you could hear the hum of the instruments. Director Wong emerged from the adjacent lab, a freshly printed electronic medical record modification log in his hand. His face was grim. Director Liu. Expert Shaw. The EMR system shows that the Regenza Phase 3 clinical trial database was batch modified 4 times between March and June 2020. Each modification targeted the efficacy assessment data exclusively. The modification timestamps are all between 2 and 4 in the morning. Lucien took the log, flipped through it and closed it. He looked at Camilla. His voice was quiet, but every word landed like a clause in a judgment. Ms. Shaw, the Regenza Phase 3 clinical trial data shows evidence of large-scale, systematic fabrication. Pursuant to Article 96 of the Drug Administration Law and Article 43 of the Good Clinical Practice Guidelines, I am formally notifying you. Shaw Pharmaceuticals is to immediately suspend all ongoing clinical trial activities for all pipeline products. All data is to be sealed pending further investigation. The verification team will issue its report within 15 business days. During this period, no person may modify, delete, transfer, or destroy any trial-related documents or electronic data without authorization. Camilla stood motionless. The first crack appeared on her face. Her lips pressed into a bloodless line. Her phone, clutched in her hand, was hot against her palm. Serafina picked up her coat and draped it over her arm. As she passed Camilla, she paused. Ms. Shaw, you said earlier that this data was the mess I left behind. Her voice was soft, so soft only Camilla could hear. You were half right. It is a mess. But it's not mine. When you took my data 3 years ago, I knew you would eventually adulterate it. You don't understand drugs. You don't understand clinical trials. You don't understand statistics. The only thing you understand is how to turn money and connections into leverage. Unfortunately, this time, your leverage isn't enough. She walked toward the lab entrance without looking back. The hem of her white coat lifted gently like a clean flag. Camilla stared at her back. Her phone screen lit up. A message from Masan. Men are in place. Awaiting your orders. Her thumb hovered over the screen for a long moment. Then she typed a single word. Wait. By the time Serafina stepped out of the Shaw Pharmaceuticals building, dusk was falling, gilding the towers of the financial district. She stood at the curb waiting for Jasper's car. Lucien caught up with her. What happened today will go into the verification report exactly as it happened. But Camilla won't accept defeat that easily. She spent years building her network within the regulatory system. She'll use every resource she has to obstruct the investigation to smear you, even... He paused. Even resort to more extreme measures. I know. Her tone was as casual as if she were reading the weather forecast. She's already making arrangements. A man named Masan on the east side of the city. Leo Lin transferred him a deposit of 200,000 2 nights ago. The memo line said, renovation costs. She pulled out her phone and showed him a screenshot. This transfer record is already stored on my server. Every extra step Camilla takes is just digging her own grave deeper. And the deeper the grave, the heavier the sentence. Lucien looked at her for a long moment. Then he laughed. A real laugh, more obvious than the one in the conference room, tinged with reluctant admiration. Serafina Shaw. You are the most terrifying woman I have ever met. Thank you. She put her phone away. Director Liu is also the least bureaucratic bureaucrat I've ever met. A black Maybach pulled up at the curb. Jasper leaned out of the driver's seat. Professor Shaw. Get in. Serafina opened the door, then glanced back at Lucien. Next week. The charity medical auction. The Shaw women will both be there. Camilla has her eye on a batch of rare medicinal materials she wants to acquire at a high price to keep Shaw Pharmaceuticals on life support. What she doesn't know is that I am the Waitoran, the consigner of that batch. And those materials originally belonged to my mother. The door closed. The Maybach merged into the evening traffic. 3 days later, the charity auction was held at the Grand Hyatt Ballroom, a gilded affair with 300 seats arranged in a fan. Everyone who mattered in the city's pharmaceutical circles was there. Victoria Shaw wore a wine-red strapless gown, diamond earrings glittering, her smile incandescent. Camilla sat at a front-row table in a sapphire blue cheapao, a jade brooch at her collar, chatting easily with pharma CEOs and bank presidents. Her eyes occasionally swept toward the back of the room. The auction proceeded through the usual lots: calligraphy, antiques, limited edition watches. Then the host announced the 8th item. An extraordinary lot. A collection of rare Chinese medicinal materials. 3 wild ginseng roots, each over 30 years old. 500 grams of premium cordyceps. 120 grams of natural bezoar. And a complete wild Ganoderma weighing over 200 grams. Total estimated value, over 8 million yuan. These materials are so rare that assembling them all at once is nearly impossible. 2 spotlights hit the stage. The display case glided forward. The materials inside gleamed under the lights. Victoria's eyes lit up. Regenza's manufacturing process required a key excipient, ginsenoside extracted from high-aged wild ginseng. Ordinary farm ginseng wouldn't work, and wild ginseng had been nearly harvested to extinction. These 30-year roots were a miracle. Mom, we have to get this batch. With this ginseng, we can at least sustain production until the Tidai Gongyi, the alternative process, is developed. And with everyone here tonight, winning this lot will show the industry that Shaw Pharmaceuticals still has strength. Camilla nodded slightly and raised her paddle. 8 million. 9 million. Came a bid from a traditional medicine wholesaler in the back. 10 million. Camilla didn't blink. 11 million. 15 million. Her voice was flat but carried the weight of absolute determination. The 2 competing bidders exchanged a look and lowered their paddles. The auctioneer raised his gavel. 15 million first call. 15 million second call. 18 million. The voice came from the side entrance, clear and carrying. Every head in the room turned. A woman in a black velvet gown walked in. Her hair swept up, revealing the elegant line of her neck. No mask. The scar on her left cheek was visible, a faint line under the warm chandelier light. Serafina Shaw. Jasperin followed behind her, suit impeccable, paddle in hand. The air in the ballroom detonated. Victoria's champagne glass nearly slipped from her fingers. She didn't even notice the wine splashing onto her dress. Her eyes were bulging. Camilla's fingers clenched around her paddle, the knuckles whitening, but her smile remained. Serafina sat at the empty table next to Camilla's, tilted her head slightly and smiled. Miss Shaw. It's been a while. Camilla's mouth twitched. Serafina. You've changed so much. I almost didn't recognize you. Really? 3 years. You haven't changed at all. Still so youthful. Serafina's voice was soft. But the auction is still in progress. Mr. Auctioneer, is my bid of 18 million valid? The auctioneer snapped out of his daze. Valid. Bidder 18 million. Camilla raised her paddle. 20 million. 22 million. 25 million. There was a grinding edge in Camilla's voice now. 30 million. Serafina was still as calm as water. The entire ballroom was breathing hard. 30 million was far beyond the actual value of these materials. This was no longer an auction, it was a war between 2 women. Victoria finally lost it. She shot to her feet, pointing at Serafina, her voice shrill. Serafina Shaw, what use do you have for these materials? Do you have a factory? A production line? You're just here to cause trouble. Serafina picked up her water glass, took a sip and spoke unhurriedly. Miss Shaw, the auction rules are that the highest bidder wins. As for what I'll do with them, I'm in a good mood, so I'll tell you. She stood. Her voice wasn't loud, but every person in the ballroom heard it. These materials were originally part of my mother Vivian Shaw's private collection. She spent 20 years acquiring them piece by piece from all over the country, intending to use them in a traditional medicine modernization research fund she planned to establish in her later years. 3 years ago, these materials were managed on her behalf by Miss Camilla Shaw, along with the rest of the Shaw family assets. Somehow they've ended up on tonight's auction block. I'm simply buying back what belonged to my mother. The room erupted. Camilla's face finally cracked. She stood, her voice icy. Serafina Shaw, stop slandering people without proof. The consignor of this lot is anonymous. What makes you claim these were your mother's? Anonymous. Serafina tilted her head and looked at the auctioneer. Mr. Auctioneer, would you mind checking the consignment contract and reading out the name of the consignor? The auctioneer fumbled with the folder. He flipped through the pages. His face changed. He looked up, his voice incredulous. The consignor is Vesper Lab. The consignor's representative is Dr. Serafina Shaw. A dead, absolute silence fell over the ballroom. Victoria collapsed back into her chair. Camilla's paddle hand dropped. Serafina was the consignor. Every bid she had called out had been driving up the price of her own lot. After the auction house commission, the money would flow right back to her. She wasn't spending money. She was using Camilla's own greed to publicly, spectacularly, slap Camilla across the face in front of every pharmaceutical power player in the city. And she was also making a declaration. These rare materials worth tens of millions and everything they represented had always belonged to the Shaw family, to her and to her mother. 30 million first call. 30 million second call. 30 million third call sold. Serafina turned to face Camilla. She took a step forward, close enough that Camilla could see every texture of the scar on her face. Miss Shaw, thank you for your spirited bidding tonight. Every time you raised your paddle, you were adding to my mother's charitable fund. Oh, and I forgot to mention, the entire proceeds from this auction, after the house commission, will be donated in my mother Vivian Shaw's name to medical aid projects in Western China. She stepped back, her smile gentle and sharp as a blade. You've done a good deed after all. She turned and walked toward the exit. The black velvet gown trailed behind her in a graceful arc. Jasper followed. As he passed Camilla, he placed a business card on the table without expression. Miss Shaw, my card. If you ever consider selling your Shaw Pharmaceuticals equity, Nebula Capital is always ready to take it off your hands. Camilla stood where she was. The paddle in her hand was crushed into a crumpled ball. Her composure was gone. The muscles at the corner of her mouth were twitching violently. In her eyes was the unhinged desperation of a cornered animal. Victoria sat slumped in her chair, mumbling, "Fake. It's all fake. She can't be alive. It's impossible." The auction dissolved into chaos. Guests streamed out, every face alight with the same expression. Tonight was worth every penny. Phones were out, posts were being made. Within half an hour, video of Serafina's confrontation with Camilla was tearing through the pharmaceutical world. In the underground parking garage in a black commercial van, Ma San sat watching the video on his phone, a cigarette dangling from his lips. A slow, vicious grin spread across his face. Serafina Shaw, huh? The boss lady was right. This woman doesn't disappear. None of us get a good night's sleep. He picked up another phone and dialed. Tell the brothers. Start preparations. In the back seat of the Maybach, Serafina's phone lit up with 3 messages. The first was from Lucien. Impressive tonight. But be careful going forward. The look in Camilla's eyes wasn't right. The second was from Franklin. If your mother could see you tonight, she would be so proud. The third was from Director Chun at the CDC. Vivian Shaw's death records have been retrieved. Confirmed homicide. One of the 2 doctors involved in the resuscitation is willing to testify. Awaiting your signal. Serafina read them all. She locked the screen, leaned back, and closed her eyes as the Maybach glided onto the elevated expressway. Then she opened them again and sent Jasper a message. The Shaw Pharmaceuticals short-selling report can be released. Contact the 3 clinical trial site directors Camilla bribed. Tell them the NMPA verification team has all the evidence. Those willing to voluntarily confess and testify against Camilla will receive leniency. Those who aren't, they can go to prison together. Sent. She flipped the phone face down on her knee and watched the city light stream past. 3 years. The net was finally closing. Camilla would be scrambling now, deploying every resource she had, including the ones that operated in the dark. That was exactly what Serafina wanted. She wanted Camilla, under the gaze of the entire world, to push herself into the abyss with her own hands. A week later, the National CDC held an emergency press conference at its academic lecture hall. 300 seats were filled by 9:30. At 10 o'clock sharp, Director Chen Yanzheng walked in, silver-gray suit, white hair, steady stride. Behind him came 5 experts, each with a nameplate and microphone. Chen adjusted his mic. Thank you all for coming. The theme of today's conference is the epidemiological characteristics of the new variant strain and adjustments to prevention and control strategies. I will announce several important decisions on behalf of the National CDC. Camera flashes flickered. First, regarding the transmissibility and pathogenicity assessment of the new variant, the CDC expert panel has completed its preliminary analysis. The chief epidemiologist will brief you shortly. Second, the panel has proposed a new tiered management approach. Third, he paused. The CDC will formally appoint a specially invited virology expert to join the expert panel, responsible for guiding the R&D of vaccines and treatments targeting the new variant. I would now like to invite this expert to introduce herself and brief you on the relevant developments. The side door opened. A woman in a white lab coat walked in. Low ponytail. A faint scar on her left cheek. A CDC work badge. She took her seat at the far right of the podium and adjusted the microphone. Good morning. I am Serafina Shaw. The shutter sounds were like a hailstorm on a tin roof. Several journalists in the back rows gasped audibly. Someone blurted, "Holy shit. It's her again?" At Shaw Pharmaceuticals headquarters, Conrad Shaw sat behind his desk, watching the CDC press conference on television. He had kept it on as background noise. Shaw Pharmaceuticals stock had fallen below its IPO price. The capital chain had a month at most. Creditors were camped in the lobby. He had no headspace for CDC briefings. But when a woman in a white lab coat appeared on the screen, the thermos in his hand crashed to the floor, soaking the Persian carpet. Serafina, his daughter. On the screen, she was calmly explaining the virological characteristics of the new variant and the vaccine development strategy. In front of her was a nameplate, National CDC Specially Appointed Expert. Behind her, the screen displayed complex molecular docking simulations and immunogenicity prediction models. Every camera in the room was trained on her. Conrad's lips were trembling. He fumbled for his phone and dialed Camilla. The moment the call connected, he roared, "Explain to me. How did Serafina become a National CE expert?" A long silence on the other end. "I'm asking you a question." He slammed his palm on the desk. "You're asking me? Who should I ask?" Camilla's voice was ice from a freezer. "Your precious daughter. 3 years ago you didn't finish her off. Now she's crawled out of the dirt. She walks into your R&D center with an NMPA badge, auditing your books. She sits on the CDC podium and briefs the national media on epidemic response. You're asking me how she became this? Why don't you ask yourself why back then you erased her records but never bothered to confirm her body?" Conrad's fingers clenched around the phone. On the television, a reporter from a central media outlet had stood up. "Dr. Shaw, what stage is your team's vaccine development for the new variant currently at? Is there a concrete timeline for market availability?" Serafina leaned toward the microphone. "Our team has completed the optimization of key antigen targets using reverse genetics. We have verified immunogenicity and protective efficacy in vitro and in animal models. We plan to submit our clinical trial application to the National Center for Drug Evaluation next month. If approved, we will complete Phase 1 and Phase 2 trials within 3 months." Another reporter rose. "Dr. Shaw, you are also the chief scientist of Vesper Lab and have attracted widespread attention for exposing the clinical trial data fabrication at Shaw Pharmaceuticals. Is there a connection between your work at the CDC and your dispute with Shaw Pharmaceuticals?" The room went quiet. Serafina was silent for 2 beats. Then she spoke into the microphone. "My personal experiences do not affect my professional judgment. Regardless of which role I stand in Vesper Lab, NMPA verification team, or CDC expert panel, I do only one thing: ensure that every pill that reaches a patient's mouth is safe, effective, and clean." She paused, her voice dropping slightly. "As for the matter between me and Shaw Pharmaceuticals, the law will provide the answer. What I can say now is this. No pharmaceutical company is above the safety of patients' lives. That is my bottom line. Silence. Then applause. Conrad stood before his television, looking at the face that was both utterly familiar and utterly strange. Familiar because those slightly upturned eyes were his late wife Vivian's eyes, exactly. Strange because those eyes now held something new, cold hard, carrying the absolute resolve of someone who had climbed back from the abyss. Camilla's voice was still coming through the phone. Now you panic? It's too late. Your precious daughter is holding an NMPA verification report, an official CDC identity, and Vesper Labs global patents. She's closing the net from 5 dimensions simultaneously. You didn't think there would be a day like this when you erased her identity back then, did you? Conrad turned off the television. As the screen went dark, he saw his own face reflected in it, pale, twisted, the face of a condemned man reading his own sentence. And he remembered something. 12 years ago. Vivian lying in the ICU, her body full of tubes, her eyes unfocused but her hand gripping his wrist with desperate strength, her lips trembling, trying to tell him something. He had bent down to listen. What he heard was a slurred whisper. Take care of Serafina. Someone is trying to harm us. He had thought she was delirious. He had pulled his hand free to take a call from Camilla, something about an important meeting at the company. By the time he came back, Vivian was gone. 12 years. He finally understood what that hand had been holding onto. Conrad sank into his chair and buried his face in his hands. The sound that leaked through his fingers, it was impossible to tell if it was laughter or weeping. That afternoon in Lucien Liu's office, the verification report sat on the desk. Over 300 pages, every section flagged with colored tabs. The summary conclusion was written in restrained language, but the findings were absolute. Large-scale, systematic fabrication of clinical trial data. Primary efficacy endpoints artificially inflated by at least 30%. Adverse event records massively redacted. Electronic medical record system showing batch modification traces, concentrated in the early morning hours. Lucien signed the final page. From his drawer, he pulled out another document, Serafina's 17-node logical inconsistency report. The two reports, cross-referenced, showed over 90% overlap. A knock. Come in. Serafina entered, still wearing the white lab coat from the CDC press conference that morning. Her CDC badge swapped for an NMPA badge. She placed a USB drive on his desk. 2 of the 3 clinical trial site directors came in this morning and gave sworn statements. Recordings and signed documents are on here. They admit to taking money from Camilla and falsifying efficacy data per her instructions. The third is still hesitating, but after watching this morning's CDC press conference, he sent me a text. He'll come in tomorrow. Lucien plugged in the drive, put on headphones and listened for several minutes. Then he removed them and leaned back in his chair, looking at Serafina with something complicated in his eyes. The third site director decided to cooperate after watching your press conference this morning? Yes. So your appearance at the CDC today, sitting under the national emblem in that white coat, it wasn't just about epidemic response. Serafina sat on the sofa and took a sip of water. Director Chun had already invited me to join the panel. The timing worked out. Though I'll admit the optics were useful. The third site director had been unwilling to come clean because he was afraid of Camilla's retaliation. After watching the press conference, he messaged me. If the national CDC is hiring you as an expert, you're clearly more powerful than Camilla. Lucien couldn't help but laugh. He walked to the window looking out at the darkening sky. The verification report draft is done. The conclusion is that data fabrication is confirmed. Regenza's market application will be rejected. Its clinical trial permit will be revoked. Shaw Pharmaceuticals will be fined. The responsible individuals will be referred to judicial authorities. Not enough. Serafina's voice came from the sofa, calm and absolute. Lucien turned. What's not enough? A fine is just a number on a ledger to Shaw Pharmaceuticals. They're nearly bankrupt anyway. Revoking a permit only blocks the future. It doesn't settle the past. She set down her cup and stood, walking over to him. What I want is Camilla prosecuted for manufacturing and selling counterfeit drugs, and for premeditated murder. Conrad prosecuted for abetting and embezzlement. Victoria prosecuted for trade secret infringement. I want every illegally transferred Shaw Pharmaceuticals asset recovered and returned to the legal heir of the Shaw family. Lucian looked into her eyes. Those eyes were as still as a lake in deep winter. But beneath the surface there were blades. The legal heir? You're referring to yourself. I'm referring to the lawful estate of my mother, Vivian Shaw. Shaw Pharmaceuticals was founded by my grandfather. My mother was the largest shareholder. After her death, Camilla used forged wills, falsified equity registrations, and fraudulent mergers to swallow every share my mother owned. I am Vivian Shaw's only biological daughter. Those shares should return to me. She paused, and a cold curve touched the corner of her mouth. Though I have no interest in Shaw Pharmaceuticals itself, after I reclaim the shares, I will join with minority shareholders to restructure the board and merge Shaw Pharmaceuticals into Vesper Lab. Every R&D pipeline will be re-audited. Anything that doesn't meet standards gets cut. The name Shaw Pharmaceuticals. Either it gets cleaned, or it disappears. Lucian was quiet for a long time. Outside, the city lights were coming on. He leaned back against the windowsill, arms crossed, studying her. You know what you sound like right now? Like someone who has already played out every move on the board, explaining to her opponent in hindsight what each move was for. He walked to his desk, picked up the verification report draft, and placed it in front of her. Once I submit this signature, the regulatory front is closed. The financial front, the criminal front, the family inheritance front. When are you planning to move? Serafina looked down at the report, then up at him. Their eyes met. One as still as lake water, one as sharp as a scalpel. The financial net is already laid. Nebula Capital has acquired 13% of Shaw Pharmaceuticals on the secondary market through 5 shell companies. 3 institutional shareholders have signed voting rights proxy agreements. We control over 25% of the voting power. When Shaw Pharmaceuticals' capital chain snaps and they file for bankruptcy protection, Nebula Capital will enter as the restructuring investor. On the criminal front, Director Chun has retrieved my mother's medical records and secured the testimony of 2 medical staff willing to come forward. The forensic report from the car crash is also in hand. The paint scrapings on the guardrail match the chassis scratches on the Audi Q7 registered to Camilla, and the traffic camera at the accident site captured a clear image of the passenger in the car. Leo Lin. On the family inheritance front, Uncle Franklin has preserved my mother's authentic handwritten will. The Guchenji Chungrun listed on it, and the version Camilla took to the notary are 2 completely different documents. She paused, looking at him steadily. There's only one last fire left to light. And that fire needs to be lit by the Shaw family themselves. What do you mean? Next week is the old patriarch's 80th birthday. To save face, Camilla is throwing a grand celebration at the old Shaw family mansion. She's invited every person of influence in the city, including several of your NMP colleagues. Serafina picked up her coat and bag. When my mother was alive, she hosted the birthday banquet every year. This year, I think it's time I went back. She opened the door, then glanced back at Lucian. Director Liu. Next week at the Shaw Mansion there will be quite a show. Bring the official version of the verification report. I want you to watch with your own eyes, as a lie that has lasted 12 years is ground to dust in the span of a single meal. The door closed. Lucian stood there, looking at the 300-page report on his desk, then at the doorway. From the corridor came the sound of Serafina's footsteps. Steady, efficient, receding. He picked up his phone and opened the photo he had taken through the car window that first day. The free clinic tent under the locust tree, Serafina in her white nurse's uniform and blue mask, bending over to take an old man's blood pressure. The first time he ever saw her. He zoomed in on those lowered eyes and stared at them for a long moment. How many more cards are you still holding? He murmured. Outside, the city lights spread like a net with no boundaries. And at one particular node in that net, the kitchen of the Shaw family mansion was frantically preparing for a grand banquet. Camilla personally designing the menu, Victoria selecting the floral arrangements, Conrad gritting his teeth to allocate a banquet budget from accounts that were nearly empty. None of them knew that the eldest daughter of the Shaw family, the one they thought had rotted away in a ravine 3 years ago, was walking toward that brightly lit old mansion, carrying 12 years of old debts and 3 years of new ones, step by step. On the day of the old patriarch's 80th birthday, the Shaw mansion was festooned with gold balloons and red carpets. A symphony orchestra played Strauss on the lawn. Camilla stood at the door in a dark red cheapao, a full suite of emerald jewelry, her hair swept into an immaculate coil, her smile a flawless mask. Victoria stood behind her, champagne-colored princess gown, diamond tiara, smile practiced to perfection. Conrad stood inside, keeping the old man company, checking his phone every few minutes, waiting for the call from his lawyer about whether the court had accepted Shaw Pharmaceuticals' bankruptcy protection filing. The guests filled the hall, NMPA officials, industry association heads, bank presidents, relatives from all branches of the family. Over a dozen tables. Crystal and champagne. Everyone working hard to maintain the illusion that everything was fine. Camilla raised her glass to deliver the toast. She spoke of the old man building Shaw Pharmaceuticals from nothing, of the family's legacy, her eyes reddening at the right moments. She raised her glass high. To the patriarch's health, long life, and to Shaw Pharmaceuticals' eternal prosperity. Bang! The doors to the banquet hall swung open. Every head turned. The orchestra stuttered to a halt. Serafina Shaw stood at the threshold. Black velvet cheapao. The scar on her face unconcealed. Her hair swept into a simple chignon. In her hand a black folder. Beside her stood Franklin Bai in a dark gray Zhongshan suit, the Chinese Medical Association badge on his chest, his expression solemn. Behind them, Jasper ran with a document case, and two uniformed police officers. Serafina took a step forward. Her heels rang against the marble. Grandfather's 80th birthday. And no one thought to notify me. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried to every corner of the hall. By the Shaw family's own traditions, the banquet cannot begin until the eldest granddaughter of the main line is present. The old man's cane struck the floor. At 80, his hair was white, but his eyes were still sharp. He stared at Serafina for a long moment. Serafina. It's me, grandfather. She stopped before the main table and inclined her head. 3 years without paying my respects. I have been unfilial. Today I've come for 2 reasons. To wish you a long life. And to show the Shaw family a few things. Camilla's smile was gone. She stepped forward, blocking Serafina, her voice low and grinding. Serafina. Today is the patriarch's birthday. If you want to cause trouble, pick another day. Aunt Camilla. Serafina cut her off, her voice level. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to seek justice for my mother. From the black folder, she drew out a sheaf of documents and held them high. Her voice rang clear. First document. My mother Vivian Shaw's original will. This document was preserved by Professor Franklin Bai for 12 years. It bears my mother's signature and fingerprint, verified as authentic by the Judicial Authentication Center. The will clearly stipulates that 35% of Shaw Pharmaceuticals' equity is to be inherited by me, Serafina Shaw. The will that Camilla Shaw took to the notary, its signature and fingerprint have been confirmed as forgeries. Second document. My mother Vivian Shaw's death records. This file was voluntarily provided to judicial authorities yesterday by a doctor who participated in the resuscitation. It shows that my mother's cause of death was not acute pancreatitis. She was overdosed with a drug that induces multi-organ failure. This drug was in inventory at Shaw Pharmaceuticals' R&D center at the time. The withdrawal record is signed by Camilla Shaw. Third document. The original investigation file on Camilla Shaw's academic misconduct from 12 years ago. The core data in her published paper was plagiarized wholesale from another researcher's work. After being reported, she dropped out of graduate school and married into the Shaw family. Conrad Shaw buried the case. Fourth document. The traffic accident investigation report from 3 years ago. The white paint scrapings on the guardrail match the chassis scratches on the Audi Q7 registered to Camilla Shaw. The traffic camera at the accident site captured the vehicle. A white Audi Q7, license plate verified as Camilla Shaw's. The driver's face is unclear, but the passenger. She paused, her gaze shifting to the corner where Leo Lin stood frozen. The passenger was captured very clearly. Fifth document. The official NMPA verification report. Regenza's Phase 3 clinical trial data shows large-scale, systematic fabrication. Over 50 subjects' data was falsified. Efficacy endpoints were artificially inflated by over 30%. Adverse events were systematically concealed. The report has been formally submitted to judicial authorities. The responsible individuals will be prosecuted for manufacturing and selling counterfeit drugs. The banquet hall was dead silent. Every eye was fixed on the documents in Serafina's hand. Every face was a mask of shock, fear, or disbelief. Camilla's face was gray-white, like cracked porcelain. Conrad gripped the edge of the table, the veins on his forehead bulging. Victoria was trembling, the diamond tiara glittering with savage irony in the chandelier light. The old man's cane struck the floor again. He stood, staring at Camilla. His voice was aged but still carried authority. "Is what she says true?" Camilla's lips trembled. Not a word came out. "Every single point she has made is true." Franklin stepped forward and placed a thick stack of materials on the main table. "I stake my reputation as a pharmaceutical scientist of 50 years on it. Every document, every signature, every seal. I have verified them all with my own eyes." The two officers stepped forward. They presented the arrest warrant and summons. "Camilla Shaw, you are under arrest on suspicion of premeditated murder, manufacturing and selling counterfeit drugs, and forging financial documents. Leo Lin, you are under arrest on suspicion of trade secret infringement and aiding in the destruction and falsification of evidence. Conrad Shaw, you are under arrest on suspicion of abetting and embezzlement. Please cooperate with the investigation." Camilla swayed. She grabbed the table to keep from falling. She turned and stared at Conrad, her eyes wild with the fury of being sold out. "Conrad, you're just going to sit there?" Conrad stood. He turned to face Serafina. His mouth opened and closed several times before sound came out. "Serafina, I didn't know your mother's death was." "You didn't know?" Serafina's voice finally gained a ripple of emotion, not anger, but a disappointment that reached to the marrow. "Of course you didn't know. You were too busy signing merger contracts, too busy buying Camilla Jade and villas, too busy playing the successful chairman and the happy husband. You didn't have time to see my mother in the ICU one last time. You didn't have time to investigate why she suddenly fell ill. And you certainly didn't have time to check whether your only daughter had been run off a mountain road." She stepped forward, close enough to see the blood vessels in his eyes. Her voice dropped so low only he could hear. "But there was one thing you did make time for. Less than 24 hours after my car crash, you erased every record of my existence. My identity, my social security, my bank accounts, all of it. You didn't just want to destroy me. You wanted to erase every trace that I ever existed. That Camilla couldn't do. Only you had the authority. So don't stand here and play the wrong, deceived husband. You're not worthy of that role." Conrad's face went ash-gray. He stumbled backward, knocking over his chair. The metal frame hit the marble with a shriek. The officers let him out. As Camilla was being taken away, she turned at the door. She looked at Serafina, standing before the main table, Franklin and Jasper behind her, the black folder open and empty on the table. Every document already distributed to the journalists and judicial officials in the room. "Serafina Shaw." Camilla's voice was hoarse. "You win. But don't celebrate too soon. You think putting me in prison is the end? Your mother stood in my way. So did you. You think you're some kind of righteous avenger? You just got lucky. You got 3 extra years to live." Serafina turned to face her. Her gaze was as calm as if she were looking at an actor who had already taken her final bow. "Miss Shaw, you've misunderstood something. I was never trying to win. I was simply here to take back what belonged to my mother and me. As for you," she paused and a faint, cold smile touched her lips. "You'll have plenty of time in prison to think about exactly where you lost." Camilla was led away. Victoria sat collapsed in her chair. No one helped her. No one even looked at her. Her carefully crafted pharmaceutical prodigy persona had been ground to dust in 5 minutes. Serafina walked to the old patriarch and placed the last document from her folder on the table before him. "Grandfather, this is a letter my mother wrote to you, a month before she died. Uncle Franklin has kept it all these years." The old man picked up the letter. His hands were shaking badly. He unfolded it and looked at his daughter's handwriting for a long, long time. Then he folded it carefully, placed it in his pocket, and looked up at Serafina. An 80-year-old man. His eyes were clouded, but his gaze was clear. Serafina, Shaw Pharmaceuticals was your grandfather's life's work. Your mother's entire youth. What do you plan to do with it? Serafina was silent for a moment. Everyone who belongs in prison will go. Every illegally transferred asset will be recovered. Every fraudulent drug will be scrapped. But the Shaw Pharmaceuticals name, I'll keep it. When I've cleaned it, it will still be the Shaw Pharmaceuticals my grandfather and my mother built. The old man's cane struck the floor a third time. This time it was soft. Like a sigh. Like a period at the end of a long sentence. Good, he said. The banquet dissolved. Serafina stood on the stone steps at the entrance of the old mansion, looking down at the city lights. Franklin stood beside her. Jasper was a short distance behind. Lucien had arrived at some point. He leaned against the door of his Mercedes, watching her silhouette from a distance. Is it all over? Franklin asked. Serafina shook her head. Camilla will talk tomorrow. She'll give up the people behind her. She didn't have the power to do all this alone, to entrench herself in Shaw Pharmaceuticals for 12 years, to manipulate clinical trial data, to bribe regulatory officials. There's a bigger network behind her. And that network is connected to the deepest, darkest roots of this industry. If I don't dig it out completely, there will be another Shaw Pharmaceuticals. Another Regenza. She paused, her voice softening. And I still have one last identity I haven't revealed. Franklin looked at her. What identity? Serafina pulled out her phone. On the screen was an encrypted email. The sender, Office of the National Special Rectification Campaign for Drug Safety. The message was 2 lines. Professor Shaw, with State Council approval, you are hereby appointed as Technical Advisor to the National Special Rectification Campaign for Drug Safety. You are authorized, during the campaign period, to access the National Clinical Trials Database and coordinate enforcement resources across regional and NMPA offices. This appointment is not yet public. The operation is codenamed Clean Source. Franklin inhaled sharply. The National Special Rectification Campaign for Drug Safety. This was the latest deployment at the national level to combat systemic fraud in the pharmaceutical industry. And Serafina had been appointed not as a consultant, but as an authorized enforcement technical advisor. The power in her hands was not some departmental seal, but a scalpel that could cut through the entire pharmaceutical industry's darkest secrets. You didn't mention this at the press conference. It wasn't the right moment. This blade needs to be drawn at precisely the right time. Franklin was silent. Then he looked up at the stars and laughed. A quiet laugh, but in the stillness of the mountainside it carried far. Vivian, your daughter has surpassed you. A week later, Camilla's case entered formal judicial proceedings. Faced with airtight evidence, she broke. She confessed to everything: the murder of Vivian Shaw, the forged will, the theft of Serafina's research, the manipulation of Regenza's clinical trials, the bribing of regulatory officials, the hiring of Massan to stage the car crash. And she gave up a name no one saw coming. Shaw Pharmaceuticals CFO Marcus Zhao is mine. He kept 2 sets of books, one for the tax bureau, one for the shareholders. Over the years, the money we siphoned out of Shaw Pharmaceuticals totals $1.8 billion. It's all in offshore shell companies. When the interrogators pressed for details, Camilla suddenly laughed. A wild, desolate sound. You think I was just greedy? When I married Conrad Shaw, he was the biggest pharmaceutical boss in the city. I thought I'd won. But no matter what I did, Conrad always had Vivian in his heart. Every time he got drunk, he called out that dead woman's name. Her voice went cold. I wanted Vivian's daughter to taste what it felt like to lose everything. What I didn't count on was that the girl was far more ruthless than her mother. Half a month later, the investigation into Camilla's case uncovered a vast gray network. The National Special Rectification Campaign for Drug Safety held a press conference, announcing that multiple pharmaceutical companies had been found to have falsified clinical trial data, and numerous NMPA officials were under investigation. The spokesperson specifically mentioned, "We extend our gratitude to the team of technical experts, represented by Professor Serafina Shaw, for their critical contributions to this campaign." With that, Serafina's fourth identity, national CDC specially appointed virology expert, was officially revealed to the public. Her fifth identity, the authorized enforcement technical advisor of Operation Clean Source, remained known to only a very few. 1 month later, the International Pharmaceutical Expo opened at the National Exhibition Center in Shanghai. 3,000 companies from over 60 countries and regions. The world's top scientists and pharma executives. Shaw Pharmaceuticals had a booth, once a leading domestic player, but it sat deserted, the staff listlessly scrolling their phones. Vesper Labs' press conference was held on the second afternoon. The hall was packed to the walls. The lights dimmed and Serafina Shaw walked onto the stage. White suit, hair loose, the scar on her left cheek clearly visible under the spotlight, not hidden. Good afternoon. Today Vesper Lab is announcing a new drug, codename M07, a next-generation EGFR-targeted inhibitor. In completed Phase 2 clinical trials, MS07 achieved an objective response rate of 81.2% in T790M mutation-positive non-small cell lung cancer patients. Median progression-free survival exceeded 15 months. Both metrics comprehensively surpass every competitor currently on the market, including the now-withdrawn Shaw Pharmaceuticals Regenza. She used the phrase including the now-withdrawn Shaw Pharmaceuticals Regenza, without a trace of mercy. The patent for MS07 is held by Vesper Lab. Vesper Lab's sole chief scientist is me. The foundational research for this patent began 4 years ago, before Shaw Pharmaceuticals stole my initial data. The molecular scaffold design and core synthesis route were already complete. What Shaw Pharmaceuticals took was an early discarded version. They never knew the real breakthrough came after that. The screen behind her displayed a molecular structure comparison between MS07 and Regenza. The two formulas differed in a critical side chain, and that difference was what accounted for the massive gap in efficacy. Pharmacologists in the audience were pulling out their phones to photograph the screen. Some were on their feet applauding. At the end of the press conference, Serafina made a second announcement. Effective today, Shaw Pharmaceuticals has formally entered bankruptcy restructuring. The restructured entity will be merged into Vesper Lab and renamed Vivian Biopharma, after my mother, Vivian Shaw. It will focus on the R&D and production of targeted cancer therapies. All legacy Shaw Pharmaceuticals R&D pipelines will undergo comprehensive re-audit. Any non-compliant products will be terminated. I make this promise. Every pill that comes out of Vivian Biopharma will be worthy of the name it carries. She walked off the stage to a standing ovation. The applause came like a tide and did not recede. Jasper stood in the wings watching Serafina walk out of the spotlight, his eyes reddening. He had known her for 3 years. He knew what she had paid to reach this moment. The lab at 3 in the morning, revising papers while steel pins still held her broken ribs together, walking into dead-end alleys while being tailed by Camilla's men and slipping out the back without changing expression. Every step she had taken had been on the edge of a blade. She had never once cried out in pain. Lucien stood beside Jasper, holding a bottle of water. He handed it to her as she came off stage. She took it, unscrewed the cap and drank. Their eyes met. The blades were still in her eyes, but on the blades now there was a trace of warmth. 3 months later, in the season of spring flowers, the sign came down from the top of the old Shaw Pharmaceuticals headquarters. Workers dismantled the characters one by one and replaced them with new ones. Vivian Biopharma. Serafina had chosen the font herself, the same handwritten style as the label on her mother's lab notebooks. Maggie stood in the crowd looking up at the new sign, a tissue clutched in her hand. Beside her were the regular patients from Locust Grove, Old Wong with his hypertension, Grandma Lee with her diabetes, the delivery driver whose leg wound Serafina had dressed every month. They had all come, dressed in their best clothes, like they were attending their own daughter's wedding. Xiao Zhou was filming everything on her phone. I always said Serafina wasn't ordinary, and none of you believed me. The day at the summit when she made that woman in the suit turn green, I knew it then. After the ceremony, Serafina and Lucien stood on the rooftop of the new building. The spring wind carried the scent of magnolias from the park. Camilla's case was decided, Lucien said. Premeditated murder. Manufacturing and selling counterfeit drugs. Forging financial documents. Multiple counts, concurrent sentence. Life imprisonment. Conrad, abetting and embezzlement. 8 years. Victoria, trade secret infringement. 5 years. Leo Lin, 3 years. Ma San and his entire crew are in custody. Serafina nodded but said nothing. Professor Bai called me yesterday. He said that if your mother could see today, she would be so happy. Serafina looked down at the newly transplanted ginkgo tree at the base of the building. She had moved it from her mother's favorite ginkgo grove. Red protective ropes were still tied around its trunk. The day my mother died, I was at school taking an exam. She told the nurse not to call me, not to disturb my exam. By the time I finished and got to the hospital, she was already gone. Her voice was very soft like wind through leaves. I owe her a goodbye. That debt is mine alone. No one else can carry it. Lucien looked at her. The spring breeze stirred the loose strands of hair at her temple. The scar on her left cheek had become, in the sunlight, a very faint, very pale gold line. He reached out and took her hand. She turned to look at him. I'm not trying to comfort you. His voice was steady, but his fingers tightened slightly around hers. I just think, you've carried everything alone for so many years. It's enough. The road ahead. I'll walk it with you. She looked into his eyes. Those eyes were like a scalpel under an operating light, calm, restrained, precise. But on that blade now was a warmth she had never seen before. Not a blazing fire but something steady, continuous, like the shadowless lamp in an operating room. Not dazzling but capable of illuminating everything. She did not pull her hand away. They stood side by side at the edge of the rooftop, watching the city below awaken in the spring sun, the financial district in the distance, the old quarter nearby, and further still, the road winding into the mountains. 3 years ago, on a night of torrential rain, a car had gone off that mountain road. But now, the woman who had crawled out of that car was standing at the highest point in the city, looking down at everything she was about to reclaim. The epilogue came quickly. Half a year later, on an ordinary workday morning, under the crooked locust tree outside Locust Grove Community Clinic, a line of elderly patients stretched to the curb. Maggie was running around barely keeping up. Xiao Zhou burst out of an exam room, clutching a blood pressure monitor. Maggie, Serafina replied. She said she's coming back to help with next Saturday's free clinic. She told us to stock extra blood pressure meds. Maggie stopped what she was doing. Her eyes brightened, then she deliberately put on a stern face. She's such a big scientist now, and she's coming back to work as a nurse in our clinic? Monthly salary $3,005, meals included, housing not included. You think she'd take that? I would. The voice came from the doorway. Everyone turned. Serafina stood there. White blouse, black trousers, low ponytail. The scar on her face was almost invisible in the sunlight. Beside her stood Lucien Liu in a dark gray suit, holding 2 large bags of medications. Maggie, I took a day off. Serafina walked in, pulled the blue nurse's uniform off its hook, and put it on with practiced ease. From her pocket, she took out a surgical mask and put it on. Today's free clinic. I'll do the blood pressure. Maggie stood there for a long moment, then burst out laughing. Mid-laugh, her eyes reddened. She turned away, pretending to organize the medicine cabinet, muttering, Everyone's gone and made something of themselves. And here I am, still in this broken-down clinic. Maggie. Serafina's voice came from behind her, very soft. This broken-down clinic is the best place I've ever lived. Maggie's hands paused. Then she tore open a box of test strips and bellowed at old Wang at the front of the line. Wang, roll up your sleeve. Blood pressure now. The crooked locust tree swayed gently in the morning breeze. Sunlight filtered through the leaves and fell on the free clinic tent, on the elderly patients waiting in line, on the back of Serafina's white nurse's uniform. At the mouth of the alley, a black Mercedes S-Class was parked. Lucien leaned against the car door, looking at his phone. A message from his assistant. Director Liu. Next week's National NMPA Commendation Conference. You and Dr. Shaw have both been nominated for Individual of the Year. The Bureau wants you to prepare a speech. Lucien looked up at the free clinic tent, at the woman bending over to take an old man's blood pressure. Her head tilted to read the gauge, her eyes lowered, the surgical mask revealing only those focused eyes above it. Exactly the same as the first time he had seen her through the car window. and utterly different. He typed a reply to his assistant. I'll write the speech myself. Also, find me an apartment in Locust Grove. Doesn't need to be big. Just close to the clinic. His assistant replied with a single question mark. Lucy unlocked his phone, put it in his pocket, and pulled open the car door. Before he got in, he looked one last time at the figure sitting under the tent. White uniform, blue mask, lowered eyes. And he knew now what lay behind those lowered eyes. A volcano. And when it erupted, the entire mountain road would be swallowed by lava. But the land the lava left behind would grow a forest denser than the one before. The engine started. The Mercedes pulled away from Locust Grove and merged into the flow of the city. Under the free clinic tent, Serafina wrapped the blood pressure cuff and said to the old man at the front of the line, Please have a seat, sir. Roll up your sleeve and relax your arm. Old Wang rolled up his sleeve. Serafina, I haven't seen you in so long. I hear you're a big scientist now. Serafina hung her stethoscope back around her neck. The rubber bulb of the blood pressure cuff gave a gentle squeeze in her hand. Old Wang, I'm just a nurse. Monthly salary $3,500. Meals included. Housing not included. Beside her, Maggie burst out laughing, and the box of test strips nearly hit the floor again.